Right now, inside a developing human embryo, something strange is happening. A tail is growing, not a metaphorical one, an actual physical tail complete with its own vertebrae, sticking out from the base of the spine like something from a biology textbook nobody shows you in school. And here's the part that should genuinely stop you for a second. Every single human embryo does this. Yours did. Mine did. Around 4 to 5 weeks into development, human embryos grow a real tail structure, somewhere between 10 and 12 vertebrae. For a brief window, a human embryo looks startlingly similar to the embryo of a mouse, a fish, or a monkey. And then it disappears. The tail gets reabsorbed, its cells repurposed, its length shrinking down until all that remains is a small cluster of fused bones at the base of your spine. You know it today as the coccyx, or if you've ever fallen hard on a hard floor, you know it as the bone that ruins your entire week. Every human alive is walking around with the leftover architecture of a tail they simply never finished building. The question is, why did our ancestors lose it in the first place? And why did it take until very recently for science to actually figure out the answer? Almost every vertebrate on Earth has a tail. Fish, reptiles, the vast majority of mammals, most primates. Monkeys use their tails constantly for balance, for leaping between trees, for correcting posture midair. Some species in Central and South America evolved tails strong enough to support their entire body weight from a branch, essentially turning the tail into a fifth hand. A tail is genuinely excellent biological engineering, which makes it even stranger that one entire branch of the primate family tree just stopped having them. Gibbons, orangutans, gorillas, chimpanzees, bonobos, humans. Not a single tail among any of them. Somewhere around 25 million years ago, the common ancestor of all apes lost its tail completely, and every single descendant species inherited that same tailless body plan. For decades, scientists could see this pattern clearly in the fossil record. They just couldn't explain what actually caused it at a genetic level. That mystery sat mostly unsolved until an accident in a New York apartment cracked it open. In 2019, a graduate student named Bo Xia was cleaning his kitchen when he cut his finger on a piece of broken glass. Nothing dramatic, just an annoying trip to the emergency room and a handful of stitches. But sitting in that waiting room, bored, slightly injured, with nothing to do, Bo Xia started thinking about scar tissue, about how differently various animals heal, about how some species can regrow entire limbs while humans are stuck forming scars instead. That train of thought eventually spiraled into a bigger question about lost body parts in general. And somewhere down that rabbit hole, he landed on the tail. He reportedly went home that same night and started reading everything he could find about tail loss in primates, which is either the most productive reaction to a minor injury in scientific history, or a sign that graduate school does genuinely strange things to a person's relationship with free time. Possibly both. Working alongside researchers at NYU, Bo Xia started investigating a gene called TBXT, long known to play a critical role in tail development across vertebrates. When they compared the TBXT gene in tailed primates versus tailless apes, they found something unexpected sitting inside it. A small chunk of extra genetic material, called an ALU element, had inserted itself into the gene at some point in ape evolutionary history. ALU elements are sometimes called jumping genes. They're small mobile pieces of DNA that can copy themselves and insert into new locations throughout the genome, usually without causing any noticeable effect at all. The human genome contains over 1 million copies of these things, scattered throughout our DNA, the overwhelming majority doing essentially nothing, except this one did something. That ALU insertion landed in a spot that interfered with how the gene gets processed, triggering something called alternative splicing. The cell's machinery started reading the gene's instructions slightly differently, producing an altered version of the TBXT protein. And that altered protein disrupts tail formation during embryonic development. The researchers didn't just want a compelling story sitting in a genome comparison. They wanted proof. So they engineered this specific genetic change directly into mice. And the mice grew little to no tails. Let that sit for a second. A single specific genetic tweak, isolated by researchers chasing a hunch that started with a kitchen accident, was enough to dramatically shorten or completely eliminate tails in laboratory mice. That's about as close to solving a 25 million-year-old evolutionary mystery as modern genetics gets. But here's the twist inside the twist. And honestly, this is the part that makes the whole story significantly darker and more interesting. The mice with this engineered mutation didn't just lose their tails cleanly. Some of them also developed neural tube defects, the same category of birth defect responsible for conditions like spina bifida in humans, where the spinal column doesn't close properly during development. In other words, the mutation that helped our ancestors lose their tails may have come bundled with a real biological cost. Not a clean upgrade, a trade-off. And this isn't just an abstract footnote about ancient ape evolution. Neural tube defects still affect human pregnancies today, which is exactly why doctors emphasize folate intake so heavily during pregnancy. Folate helps reduce the risk of neural tube defects. It's genuinely strange to consider that a small genetic change from 25 million years ago might still be quietly tangled up with a medical concern that expecting parents are warned about at every prenatal appointment. That mutation swept through the ancestral ape population. It removed the tail. It nudged up the risk of a serious developmental defect. And it spread through the entire lineage anyway, which means whatever advantage came with losing the tail was significant enough to outweigh that increased risk, generation after generation, for millions of years. So what was the advantage? Around the time apes lost their tails, their movement style was shifting dramatically. Monkeys tend to move along the tops of branches using a long tail as a counterbalance. Apes increasingly relied on a completely different strategy, swinging below branches using their arms. A style you can still watch gibbons perform today with genuinely alarming speed. A balancing tail becomes significantly less useful when you're hanging beneath a branch instead of running along the top of one. In fact, a long trailing tail might have actively gotten in the way, a dangling liability rather than a helpful counterweight. Losing it may have streamlined this new style of movement entirely, and this shift didn't just change how apes moved through trees. Many researchers believe it laid the groundwork for what came much later: increasingly upright posture, eventually, full bipedalism. A body already restructured around vertical movement rather than four-legged running may have been considerably better positioned to eventually stand up and walk on two legs. So, in a strange roundabout way, that one tiny piece of jumping DNA landing in exactly the right spot inside one gene may have quietly set the stage for the entire trajectory of human evolution that followed. No tail meant a different way of moving. A different way of moving eventually meant walking upright, and walking upright meant hands were free for everything that came next: tool use, complex manipulation, language, eventually entire civilizations, all resting on a foundation that started with losing something as seemingly minor as a tail. There's one more strange detail worth knowing before we finish. Every so often, extremely rarely, a baby is born with what doctors call a vestigial human tail, a small soft tissue protrusion at the base of the spine. These cases are exceptionally uncommon. They typically resolve with straightforward surgical removal, but they're a striking reminder that the ancient biological instructions for building a tail haven't fully vanished from our genome. They're still in there, mostly silent, occasionally slipping past the usual developmental override. It's a bit like discovering your house still has the wiring for an appliance nobody in your family has used for several generations, quietly dormant behind the walls, waiting for a circumstance that almost never comes. So the next time you feel your coccyx after sitting too long on a hard chair, remember what you're actually touching, not some random leftover bone with no story. The final remnant of a body part your ancestors relied on for millions of years, deliberately switched off by one small accidental genetic insertion that arrived with a hidden cost attached and turned out to be worth it. Drop one word in the comments if this genuinely surprised you. Tailbone. I want to know if you'll ever look at your coccyx the same way again. And if stories like this where one tiny accident of biology quietly reshapes the entire future of a species, are your kind of thing. That's exactly what Ink Origin is here for. Every week, we go looking for the questions hiding underneath the questions everyone is already asking: ancient humans, animal psychology, the strange science of being alive. Subscribe if that's your kind of thing. It's free. And 25 million years ago, one small piece of DNA landed in exactly the wrong place and accidentally built everything that came after.